Most passengers believed the delay was caused by bad weather. They never imagined it began with one pilot refusing to share the cockpit with her own black co-pilot. What looked like an ordinary disagreement quickly unraveled into something far more disturbing, exposing prejudice where trust and professionalism should have mattered most. But the person being judged wasn't powerless, and within minutes a decision was made that would end careers, shock an entire airline, and force everyone involved to face the consequences of their actions. The question wasn't whether racism had crossed the line, it was who had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. Long before that flight appeared on the departure board, Captain Victoria Hayes had earned a reputation for being one of the airline's most experienced pilots. Years of flawless performance, confident leadership, and an impressive resume had made her a respected figure inside the company. Passengers trusted her without ever knowing her name, and junior crew members admired the confidence she carried into every cockpit. To most people, she represented the professionalism travelers expected from a major airline. That same morning, another pilot walked through the terminal with a very different story behind his calm expression. First Officer Marcus Bennett had spent nearly 2 decades proving himself in an industry where every mistake was magnified and every success often went unnoticed. Raised in a hard-working family that taught him discipline over excuses, Marcus had dedicated his life to aviation. Every license, every certification, and every promotion had been earned through relentless commitment. His colleagues knew him as someone who prepared more than anyone else, remained calm under pressure, and never allowed emotion to interfere with safety. Outside the cockpit, Marcus lived a life built on service. Before becoming a commercial pilot, he had proudly served as a law enforcement officer, believing that protecting people extended beyond wearing a badge. Even after changing careers, that sense of responsibility never disappeared. Whether wearing a police uniform or a pilot's wings, his mission had always been the same: bringing people home safely. Few passengers boarding Flight 728 knew any of that. Families settled into their seats, business travelers opened laptops, children pressed their faces against the windows, and flight attendants completed their final safety checks. It looked like thousands of ordinary departures taking place across the country every single day. The aircraft was modern, the weather forecast was favorable, and every system had passed inspection. There was no visible reason the flight shouldn't leave exactly on schedule. Marcus arrived at the cockpit carrying nothing but his flight bag and years of experience. His checklist was complete before most people had even found their seats. To him, it was another routine assignment with another captain he expected to work alongside professionally. He believed the day would be remembered for nothing more than a smooth takeoff and an uneventful landing. But the moment Captain Hayes looked up and saw the man assigned as her co-pilot, something shifted. The atmosphere inside the cockpit grew noticeably colder. Routine procedures suddenly slowed. Crew members exchanged uncertain glances without understanding why. No alarm sounded, no emergency warning lights flashed, yet the tension became impossible to ignore. A decision was beginning to take shape, one that had nothing to do with flying ability, safety records, or experience. No passenger could hear what was happening behind the reinforced cockpit door. They only noticed that departure time came and went without explanation. Some assumed it was air traffic. Others blamed weather or maintenance. None of them realized they were witnessing the beginning of a controversy that would soon spread far beyond the airport. Within minutes, a single judgment would transform an ordinary flight into a national story about prejudice, power, and accountability. And before the aircraft ever left the gate, the person many assumed held all the authority was about to discover that appearances can be dangerously misleading. The silence inside the cockpit became impossible to ignore. Marcus Bennett had completed every pre-flight responsibility exactly as he had done hundreds of times before. Every checklist had been verified. Every safety procedure had been followed. Nothing about his performance gave anyone a reason to question his ability. Yet the atmosphere around him changed the instant Captain Victoria Hayes realized who her assigned co-pilot was. Without raising her voice, she made it clear that she refused to continue the flight with Marcus. At first, the cabin crew assumed it was a disagreement over scheduling or flight operations. Such issues occasionally happened in commercial aviation. But as the minutes passed,
whispers spread between flight attendants and ground personnel. They noticed something unusual.
The discussion had nothing to do with weather, maintenance, fatigue regulations, or aircraft safety. It was about the man standing in the cockpit. Marcus remained composed. Years of serving both in law enforcement and commercial aviation had taught him that losing control of his emotions would only make a difficult situation worse. He knew every eye in the cockpit was quietly watching him, waiting to see how he would react. Instead of responding with anger, he continued reviewing flight documents as though nothing had happened. That calmness only seemed to increase the discomfort around him. Captain Hayes insisted that she could not trust him as her co-pilot.
No evidence supported the claim.
His training record was exceptional.
His flight hours exceeded many captains in the company.
His evaluations consistently praised his judgment under pressure.
Yet none of those accomplishments appeared to matter anymore.
The delay reached 10 minutes.
Passengers began checking their watches.
Some complained to the flight attendants, believing another routine airline delay had interrupted their travel plans. Others stared through the windows, wondering why the aircraft remained parked at the gate despite perfect weather outside.
Meanwhile, airport operations requested an explanation.
The answers coming from the cockpit raised immediate concern.
Within minutes, supervisors arrived near the aircraft.
They expected to resolve a routine personnel disagreement.
Instead, they discovered allegations that had nothing to do with aviation standards.
Several crew members lowered their eyes, unwilling to involve themselves. Others looked visibly uncomfortable, realizing they were witnessing something that should never happen inside a professional flight crew.
Marcus still refused to argue.
His confidence came from something no one else seemed to know.
Every major airline maintained strict policies against discrimination. Modern aircraft carried cockpit voice recorders. Airport gates were monitored by multiple security cameras.
Crew scheduling systems documented every assignment, every delay, and every communication. The longer this confrontation continued, the more evidence was quietly being created. Captain Hayes, however, appeared convinced that her authority alone would settle the matter. She demanded another co-pilot. Ground operations refused to make an immediate change. That refusal transformed an uncomfortable delay into a full-scale corporate crisis. More managers arrived at the gate. Security personnel stood nearby without interfering. Passengers grew increasingly frustrated as rumors spread throughout the cabin. Some believed there was a mechanical failure. Others suspected a security threat. No one imagined the real reason the aircraft remained motionless was an act of racial discrimination unfolding only a few feet away.
Then came the moment that changed everything.
One senior operations executive received a phone call after reviewing the incident report.
As more information surfaced, expressions across the management team shifted from confusion to disbelief.
Whatever had just been uncovered instantly changed the balance of power. The captain who believed she controlled the situation had no idea that the person she had tried to remove from the cockpit possessed authority, credibility, and influence far beyond what anyone at that gate had assumed. And before the aircraft ever pushed back from the terminal, the careers of several people were about to take a devastating and irreversible turn. The tension that had been building behind the cockpit door finally reached its breaking point. The senior operations executive stepped aboard the aircraft with two members of the airline's corporate compliance team. The casual expressions they had worn only minutes earlier were gone. Every movement became deliberate, every question carefully documented.
They were no longer trying to get a delayed flight into the air.
They were trying to understand how a routine departure had become the center of a potential discrimination investigation. Captain Victoria Hayes remained confident. She believed her seniority would protect her. She insisted that she had simply lost confidence in her assigned co-pilot and argued that a captain should never be forced to fly with someone she did not trust. But when investigators asked her to identify a single performance issue, safety violation, or professional concern supported by Marcus Bennett's record, the silence that followed spoke louder than any explanation she could have offered.
There was none. Marcus stood quietly as his employment file was reviewed in real time. Thousands of flight hours. Outstanding simulator evaluations. Commendations for handling in-flight emergencies. Years of disciplined service, first as a law enforcement officer and later as a commercial airline pilot. Every document told the same story.
He had earned every position through professionalism, experience, and exceptional performance.
The evidence left only one question. If his qualifications were beyond dispute, why had he been rejected?
Around them, the cabin had fallen strangely quiet.
Passengers sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding.
Through the partially open cockpit door, they could see airline executives gathering, security officers standing by, and crew members exchanging anxious glances. Phones quietly appeared in passengers' hands as speculation spread throughout the cabin.
Then came the moment no one expected. The compliance director received the final report from airport security.
It included timestamps, witness statements, operational records, and surveillance footage documenting exactly how the incident had unfolded from the moment Marcus entered the aircraft. There was no misunderstanding.
No missing context. No safety concern. The pattern was unmistakable.
For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then the senior executive looked directly at Captain Hayes before turning to the rest of the crew.
The delay was no longer considered an operational issue. It had become a serious violation of the airline's equal employment and professional conduct policies.
Within moments, every member of the operating crew who had supported or failed to report the discriminatory conduct was instructed to step off the aircraft pending immediate investigation.
Identification badges were collected. Flight assignments were suspended.
Replacement crew members were already being called to the gate. The expressions that had once reflected certainty suddenly gave way to disbelief.
Captain Hayes watched the authority she believed she possessed disappear almost instantly. Marcus never celebrated. He never smiled.
He simply stood with the same calm professionalism he had shown from the beginning, understanding that this moment was larger than personal vindication. It was about protecting the standards that every qualified professional deserved, regardless of race. As the original crew quietly walked down the jet bridge under the watch of corporate officials, the passengers finally understood why their flight had been delayed. The cockpit had become the place where prejudice collided with accountability.
And accountability had won.
But the consequences of that decision were only beginning to unfold, and what happened after the aircraft finally left the gate would send a message that reached far beyond a single airline.
The aircraft eventually departed with a replacement crew.
For the hundreds of passengers on board, it became another completed journey. They reached their destination safely, collected their luggage, and continued with their lives. But few of them would ever forget the delay that forced them to witness how quickly prejudice could disrupt a place where trust, professionalism, and human lives should always come first. For Marcus Bennett, the flight was never the real victory. His greatest achievement had not been proving that he deserved the seat beside the captain. His record had already done that years before. The true victory was refusing to let discrimination change the kind of professional he had worked so hard to become. He never responded with anger, never allowed humiliation to overshadow his discipline, and never abandoned the principles that had guided him throughout his careers in both law enforcement and aviation. In the weeks that followed, the airline completed its internal investigation. The findings reinforced what had become painfully clear that day: qualifications cannot be measured by skin color, and prejudice has no place in an industry where every crew member depends on one another. The incident prompted renewed discussions about accountability, bias awareness, and the responsibility every employee carries to challenge discrimination rather than remain silent in the face of it. For many of the crew members who had stood by without speaking, the experience became a lasting lesson.
Silence can become part of injustice.
Doing nothing can sometimes protect the wrong person while abandoning the one who deserves fairness. The story also spread far beyond the airline. Aviation professionals, passengers, and communities across the country debated how bias can survive even inside professions built on strict standards, extensive training, and measurable performance.
It reminded people that discrimination is not always loud.
Sometimes it hides behind assumptions, authority, or quiet decisions that seem insignificant until someone's dignity is placed on the line.
Marcus returned to doing what he had always done. He prepared for every flight. He greeted every crew with professionalism.
He focused on the passengers whose safety depended on everyone in the cockpit working as one team. He refused to let one person's prejudice define the career he had spent decades building.
His quiet resilience became more powerful than any public argument could have been.
Because real strength is often revealed not in the moment of humiliation, but in the choice to rise above it without surrendering your integrity. Stories like this continue to resonate because they reflect a truth that extends far beyond airports. Across countless workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and institutions, people are still judged before they are known.
Opportunities are still questioned because of appearance instead of ability.
And every time that happens, society loses something valuable.
The lesson is simple but demanding. Respect should be earned through character. Trust should be built through actions. Opportunity should be determined by merit. When prejudice replaces those principles, everyone pays the price.
Perhaps the most unforgettable part of this story is that the cockpit was never the real battleground. The real battle was between bias and fairness, between assumptions and evidence, between fear and integrity. On that day, fairness prevailed not because it was easy, but because people ultimately chose accountability over silence.
The next time you hear a story about discrimination, ask yourself one question. If you had been standing there, would you have remained silent, or would you have been the person willing to stand for what was right?
If this story made you think, share it with someone else. Conversations create awareness, awareness inspires action, and action is how lasting change begins. Because the fight against racism is never won by one person alone, it is won every time ordinary people choose justice over prejudice.